We'll be studying from the book of Amos tonight. It's good to see each of you here. At this point in the nation of Israel, Israel had reached a peak in prosperity. God had restored to them some land that had been taken away from them earlier, and you can go back and read through certain sections of Kings and Chronicles for some of this information, but God had brought them back to a state of prosperity following one of their many down times, I guess you could say. So He had restored to them much of what they had lost. As a result of that prosperity, as a result of that gift from God, so to speak, they had turned that gift from God into a god itself. That is, because of their prosperity, they have now begun to worship and serve material things more than the God who restored those material things to them. This is a time about mid-8th century BC. And it's interesting when you begin reading about what Amos has to say. Some of the references in the book to the nation itself, what he has to say is not very complimentary. As a matter of fact, if you look, for example, in chapter 4, verses 1, 2, and 3, hear this word, ye kine of Bashan, that are in the mountain of Samaria, which oppress the poor, which crush the needy, which say to their masters, bring, let us drink. The Lord God hath sworn by His holiness that, lo, the day shall come upon you, that He will take you away with hooks, and your posterity with fish hooks. And ye shall go out at the breaches, every cow at that which is before her, and ye shall cast them into the palace, saith the Lord. What does Amos, speaking from the Lord, of course, call the people of Israel in this section? Fat cows. How many of you want to be referred to in that way? Probably not too many. But yet that's the way he refers to them. They were people who were feasting upon the finest of foods. They were drinking the finest of wines. They were being provided with the finest entertainment that could be found in the land that day. You can read much of that in chapter 6, verses 4 and 5 especially. It talks about them lying upon beds of ivory, stretch themselves upon their couches, eat their lambs out of the flock, the calves out of the midst of the stall, that chant to the sound of the viol, invent to themselves instruments of music like David, that drink wine in bowls, anoint themselves with the chief ointments, but they are not grieved for the affliction of Joseph. So what kind of a picture do you get? People who are enjoying the greatest degree of luxury that they could know at this point in their history. That's the way they are described. In chapter 5 and in verse 11, you'll notice he says, "For as much therefore as your treading is upon the poor, and ye take from him burdens of wheat, ye have built houses of hewn stone, but ye shall not dwell in them. Ye have planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink wine of them." So they are people who, because of their oppression of the poor, have been able to build houses not out of rough stone, but out of hewn stone. And they have been able to plant vineyards to their own desire. That's what the idea there of the pleasant vineyards, vineyards of your desire. What kind of a picture do we get? A picture of a people who are living in the lap of luxury. People are enjoying all of the material things that can be provided for them. What did they want? More. More. Read somewhere where some fellow was asked how much money would be enough money. And he said, $1 more than I have at any point. You get another $1, what do you want? One more than that. You get another one, you want one more than that. In other words, there's just no point of satisfaction with material things. That's the way Israel is at this point. You notice in chapter 8, we're going to bring all of this in to a head here in a moment. In chapter 8, in verses 5 and 6, they say, "When will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn in the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat, making the ephah small and the shekel great, and falsify the balances by deceit, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes, yea, and sell the refuse of the wheat." So where are we? Well, they're now cheating one another in order to have more, falsifying the scales. It's actually not falsifying the scales, but I went to the store the other day to pick up a few things and picked up some item, I think a bag of sugar or whatever, and I was talking about how much cheaper it was than another kind that's sitting on the shelf. Ann said, "What size bag was it?" I said, "Well, 5-pound bag, that's what was there." She said, "Go check." I bet it was a 4-pound bag. And it was. 4-pound bag. Sitting right amongst the 5-pound bags. What are you supposed to believe? 5-pound bag. Intent to deceive. I'll be convicted of that until somebody proves me different. I just believe that was their purpose. Deceit. Stupidity on my part? Yes. Chapter 5, no amens there. Verses 21 through 26. You'll notice how he talks about, I despise your feast days. I will not smell in your solemn assemblies. Though ye offer me burnt offerings and your meat offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs, for I will not hear the melody of thy vows. But let judgment run down as waters, and righteousness as a mighty stream. Have ye offered unto me sacrifices and offerings in the wilderness 40 years, O house of Israel? What are they doing? They're still worshiping God. Offering all of these different offerings and sacrifices. Why will God not accept it? Look at the very next verse. But ye have borne the tabernacle of your Moloch, and Chion your images, the star of your God, which ye made to yourselves. So they're worshiping God, but at the same time what? Worshiping other gods. So they were just worshiping God among the various gods that they were worshiping. God's not going to accept that kind of worship. And so it seems that, just look at chapter 4 one more time. In chapter 4, verses 6 through 11. And you'll notice in verse 6, in verse 8, in verse 9, in verse 10, and in verse 11, you'll find a common phrase. And what is it? Yet have ye not returned unto me, saith the Lord. Now, you'll notice in each of those cases that he mentions, God says, I've done certain things in the midst of you to try to bring you to your senses. I've done things good to you. I've done things against you. But what response has it had? None whatsoever. They're just simply not paying attention in that regard. In chapter 5 and in verse 10, they hate him that rebuketh in the gate. They abhor him that speaketh uprightly. Who is the person that rebuketh in the gate? Prophets of God. Elders of that day would sit in the gate and try to encourage the people to do what was right. They're not paying any attention to that at all. And of course, just a little bit later, let's hold on just a minute. Chapter 2 and verse 12. But ye gave the Nazarites wine to drink, and commanded the prophets, saying, prophesy not. Now keep in mind the picture that's building here. We've come through a picture of people living at the height of prosperity. They've got the finest wine, the finest food, the finest entertainment. Much of that they have gained as a result of cheating their own brethren, especially the poor. They have refused all of the efforts at this point that God has laid before them to try to bring them to their senses. None of that's worked. In chapter 2 and verse 12, it seems that they have even tried to corrupt the righteous. It's not enough what they're doing themselves, but now they're trying to corrupt other people. And then in chapter 7, verses 10 to 13, this is where you get to Amos specifically, Ken. You mentioned him a moment ago by name. Also Amaziah, and Amaziah was the priest of Bethel, said unto Amos, O thou seer, go, flee thee away into the land of Judah, and there eat bread, and prophesy there. But prophesy not again any more at Bethel, for it is the king's chapel, and it is the king's court. What's at Bethel? All right, it's one of the two places of worship that Jeroboam had erected when the division of the land came and the northern 10 tribes became known as Israel, the southern Judah. Jeroboam, the king of the northern, didn't want them going back to the south to worship in Jerusalem, where God had specified that they should worship. And so he set up altars at Dan and Bethel. So whose place was that at Bethel? You know, Amaziah spoke correctly here. That wasn't God's house, was it? God's house is in Jerusalem. This is the king's court. This is the king's chapel, as he notes in that regard. And so they, one of the passages that we noted right there in chapter 8 in verse 5. When will the new moon be gone, that we may sell corn, and the Sabbath, that we may set forth wheat? What's happened to the Sabbath? I thought it was a day set apart, the holy Sabbath. Not anymore. It's not even recognized as the holy day that God had set it aside to be anymore. It's just another day for them to try to make money. Does that sound like any other nation that you might be affiliated with? I shouldn't have used the word affiliated with there. Sounds a lot like us, doesn't it? Sounds a lot like our nation. A nation that has prospered beyond most of the nations of this world. We have the finest entertainment, all of the finest of material things. People are cheating one another to try to gain more. What does the Lord's Day mean anymore? Basically nothing to the nation as a whole. I can remember, and most of you can probably, when you would be hard pressed to find a business open on Sundays. And now you're hard pressed to find one that's closed. The only one I can think of is Chick-fil-A. Sorry about that, Chris. But now they're all open on Sunday. Why? Sunday is just like Thursday or Friday as far as business. That's what's happened right here. Now that famous statement in chapter 3 and verse 3. With all of that in the background, see if you can figure out why Amos raises this question. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Now, we pulled that passage out of its context through the years, and I realize that there are principles that can be made in other places relative to that statement. But what's his point here? Israel, you cannot walk with God because you're not even beginning to be in agreement with God anymore. You can't walk with God. You're not walking in a direction that will allow you to walk with God. And so when we think about our own nation, we must think about it in that regard. And I have a great appreciation for those who continue to pray for our leaders, that something can be done to turn this nation around, that in some way the leaders of our nation will begin to focus again on certain biblical principles that have been long forgotten. And so that's what you basically have in the book of Amos. That's the picture of Israel at this point. They're not walking with God. Who was Amos? A very unlikely candidate to prophesy to a nation who is at the height of its prosperity. Who was he? He was a farmer, a sheep man, dresser of sycamore fruit. Out of where? Out of the south. That's why Amaziah said to him, go back home. We don't want you up here. We're not interested in what you have to say up here. Go back home. Go back to the south. So he was a farmer, sheep man from a small hill village by the name of Tekoa, about 12 miles south of Jerusalem. But now he's sent by God to go and prophesy, specifically in this case, against Israel. Now you'll notice in that regard that within the and we put this in the outline, the basic outline, there is a pronouncement of judgment against the surrounding nations. You have mention of Damascus. Now, what country does Damascus represent? Syria. So there's condemnation against Syria for the cruelty because they have threshed Gilead with threshing instruments of iron. In verse 6, you have the transgressions against Gaza, which is the country of Philistia. This particular case, chapter 1, verses 6 through 8 there, selling the Israelites into slavery to the Edomites. In verse 9 and 10, you have the country of Phoenicia, as Tyrus is mentioned there. Edom in verses 11 and 12. You have Ammon in verse 13, Moab in chapter 2, verse 1. Now, how do you think Israel is responding to Amos down through chapter 2 and in verse, actually on through verse 5? Because verses 4 and 5 is his speaking against Judah. So how's Israel feeling at this point? Boy, preach on, brother. Preach on. He's telling them like it is. He's showing them the mess they're in. He's going to straighten them out. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Israel. Uh-oh. We're going to get close to home now. Verse 6, we've come all the way to Israel. We've covered all the countries around that have had any negative impact against Judah and Israel, against God's people in general. We've now dealt with Judah, verses 4 and 5, and now he's coming to Israel in verse 6. And so then you get into some of the statements that we've noted earlier that pretty well describes the situation. But when you look at the prophecies of Amos in view of all that we've looked at so far, you need to look at the prophecies. He is obviously very earnest in his prophecies relative to not only these nations, but when he gets to Israel, he really expands what he has to say. He is urgently pleading with them to turn. Look in chapter 5 again. In verse 4, in verse 6, in verse 14, in verse 15, what is Amos pleading with the people to do? Seek the Lord. Turn to the Lord. For thus saith the Lord unto the house of Israel, verse 4, seek ye me, and ye shall live. But look at verse 5. But seek not Bethel. Now keep in mind, what did Amaziah say? Don't prophesy anymore in Bethel. Because you see, he's spoken specifically against that city. This is the king's court. This is the king's place. Go back to the south. But God says, don't seek Bethel. Verse 6, well, in latter part of verse 5, for Gilgal shall surely go into captivity, and Bethel shall come to naught. So if you seek after Bethel, you're going to seek that which is going to be gone shortly. Seek the Lord, and ye shall live. Verse 6. Then you come down to verse 14, and he says, seek good and not evil, that ye may live. What's the difference in saying seek God that you may live and saying seek good and not evil that you may live? There's no difference. If we seek God, we're going to seek good. If we seek God, we're going to hate evil. And so the Lord, the God of hosts, shall be with you as ye have spoken. Hate the evil and love the good. Establish judgment in the gate. See, there's the correction of the incorrect balances that we talked about a while ago. It may be that the Lord God of hosts will be gracious unto the remnant of Joseph. Dropping on down to verse 18 of that chapter, he says, "Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord! To what end is it for you?" The day of the Lord is darkness and not light. In other words, you think that you're serving God, but you're not. He's already raised that question, can two walk together except they be agreed? They're not in agreement with God. So why would they call on the day of the Lord to come? The day of the Lord obviously is a reference to judgment of God. But under their present circumstances, where will they be at the day of the Lord? Well, they'll be found wanting. They'll be found lacking. Interesting in chapter 7 as well, when you look at Amos' prophecy relative to these people. In the first 6 verses of chapter 7, "Thus hath the Lord God showed unto me, and behold, he formed grasshoppers in the beginning of the shooting up of the latter growth. And lo, it was the latter growth after the king's mowings. It shall come to pass that when they had made an end of eating the grass of the land, then I said, O Lord God, forgive, I beseech thee. By whom shall Jacob arise? For he is small." What's Amos doing here? He's pleading to God. He's actually interceding on their behalf. Does that idea of grasshopper bring anything to remembrance? Oh yeah, we've already studied about that, Joel, last week. The devastating destruction that would come. Well, Amos sees that as well. And in verse 5, "Then said I, O Lord God, cease, I beseech thee. By whom shall Jacob arise? For he is small. The Lord repented for this. This also shall not be, saith the Lord God." So not only is he pleading for them to seek the Lord, he even goes to God on their behalf. He intercedes for them. But you'll notice, within those warnings, he gives several things that we need to look at as well. Again, back up to chapter 5 and in verse 11. You remember those hewn stones out of which they had built their houses? Because of their wealth, they could afford those special stones. What's going to happen to those hewn stone houses? Ye shall not dwell in them. Who's going to dwell in them? Yeah. When Assyria came in and took Israel captive, they took many of the Israelites not only into Syria but into other countries of the world. And many of the Assyrians came in and lived in their houses, the ones that were not torn down as a result of the captivity. You've built them, but you're not going to be able to live in them. You've planted pleasant vineyards. You have planted vineyards just like you desired to plant. But what? You're not going to enjoy the fruit of them. Somebody else is going to enjoy the fruit of those vineyards. In chapter 6, we noted a moment ago about their luxury of beds of ivory, wine in bowls, the entertainment that they had. Verse 7, "Therefore now shall they go captive with the first that go captive, and the banquet of them that stretch themselves shall be removed." Now you're throwing a party for yourselves now, but there's going to come a time when you will not be able to party. In chapter 9 and verse 1, you find that the Lord is going to tear down the altars and the idols that they have built. And then in verses 2, well, look right in the middle of verse 1 there of chapter 9. And I will slay the last of them with the sword. He that fleeth of them shall not flee away, and he that escapeth of them shall not be delivered. Though they dig into hell, thence shall mine hand take them. Though they climb up to heaven, thence will I bring them down. Though they hide themselves in the top of Carmel, I will stretch and take them out thence. And though they be hid from my sight in the bottom of the sea, thence will I command the serpent, and he shall bite them. And though they go into captivity before their enemies, thence will I command the sword, and it shall slay them. And I will set mine eyes upon them for evil, and not for good. It just doesn't sound like it could get much worse than what Amos says is about to happen. And what a different picture that is. No escape. Even back in chapter 5, verses 18 and 19, he talks about the same thing. You can flee, but you can run, but you can't hide, as we say sometimes. You know, it sounds a lot like the psalmist, where is it? Psalm 139, isn't it? When he talks about, how shall I flee from the presence of the Lord? The highest mountain, the deepest sea, the darkest spot on the face of the earth. You cannot escape the presence of the Lord. And so, when we look at our own selves in that regard, we need to learn some lessons. Now, look in chapter 4 and in verse 12. Another famous statement of Amos. Therefore thus will I do unto thee, O Israel, and because I will do this unto thee, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel. What's that going to mean to them? How's it going to affect them? Obviously didn't. Because they were later taken into captivity. In spite of the fact that men like Joel and Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah and all of the others who prophesied before the captivity, nothing seemed to happen to change their minds, to get them to turn around. Not for any appreciable amount of time, to say the least. But then that statement in chapter 3 and verse 3, can two walk together except they be agreed? Bless you. That was said, of course, relative to these people and their departure from God. But is there not a principle that applies to us? You think about John 17. What did the Lord pray for on that occasion? Unity. That they all may be one, as thou, Father, art in me and I in thee, that they may be one in us. Prayed for unity. Prayed that we walk together. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 10, what had happened to the church at Corinth? They had become divided. They were not speaking the same thing. And there are a host of other passages in that regard. And so we need to learn the lesson. We need to walk with God. Need to walk with God. Note, if you will, chapter 2 again, and in verse 12. They gave the Nazarites wine to drink, commanded the prophets, saying, prophesy not. You have the same thing we've already noted in chapter 7 with regard to Amos. Go back home. Go back south. We don't want you up here. Think about that in regard to what we have already studied, and I'm confident that we mentioned this back when we looked at the book of Isaiah, chapter 30 and in verse 10. Well, verse 9, that this is a rebellious people, lying children, children that will not hear the law of the Lord, which say to the seers, see not, and to the prophets, prophesy not unto us right things, speak unto us smooth things, prophesy deceits. Have the same concept in Micah chapter 2 and in verse 6. So not only were the people saying, don't prophesy, but they were saying, don't prophesy right things. Tell us what we want to hear. What did Paul say to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4? For the time will come that they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned into fables. Nothing's really changed, has it? Did these people learn their lesson? No. Have we learned anything from them, generally speaking? No. Now, hopefully some of us have learned, and in some areas at least doing better. You'll notice as well an interesting point in passing in chapter 1 in verse 1. He begins to set the time of Amos, the words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam the son of Joash king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Now, what earthquake was that? I mean, there have been earthquakes all over the place. But something special about this earthquake. Well, if you have a marginal reference there, it'll probably send you to Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 5, where Zechariah refers back to that earthquake. It seems that there was a time when there was a special earthquake that God sent into this part of the country to try to, among other things, get the attention of the people of God. This wasn't just any earthquake. This was the earthquake. One specifically mentioned by God, by the prophets, as if from God himself. Didn't faze the people apparently in that regard. So he prophesies about what's going to happen. Down in the latter part of the outline, we looked at some things suggesting that religion is evaluated by conduct in society. Simply what we mean by that is, what kind of religion do we really have? Do we have the kind of religion that is the same what we teach and what we live? Or do we teach one thing and live something else? You remember the Pharisees of Jesus' day? And how Jesus warned, do as they say, not as they do. Why? Because they say and do not. Their teaching and their life is not the same. Just some ideas that we might think about. Do we teach the necessity of faith plus works? Do we teach that? That faith and works must be coupled together? We teach that. But do we often live our lives as if it really was faith only? We say, James said, show me thy faith without thy works. Now I'll show you my faith by my works. How are you going to show you faith without works? Can't do it. So we teach faith and works. But if we don't work, we're living as if it's faith only. We teach the necessity of obedience. We quote passages like Matthew 7 and Hebrews 5, 8, and 9. But if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves living as if once saved, always saved was the case. We cease to be obedient to the will of God. We teach, Ephesians 5:11, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but oftentimes we make no distinction relative to those with whom we associate. So we're teaching one thing and we're doing something else. We teach purity of life, and yet our speech, our lack of honesty, a lot of other things could be thrown into that, would indicate something different by the way we live. Well, what were these people doing? Why, they were offering up their offerings and their sacrifices right and left. They were having their assemblies. They were lifting their voice in song to God. They were going through all the motions. But what about their daily life? What about society? Well, their religion was different in society than it was in their teaching. And I think that's one of the greatest lessons out of the book of Amos. So we make sure that our life in society in general is in harmony with what we teach. And so you can look down through there. But with materialism, idolatry, injustice, those things still exist. Do you think it might be time for us to put down the remote, get out of our recliners, and get on our knees and pray to God and go to work for the cause of Christ? How far removed am I personally from the description that Amos gives of the people of his day? Try to get people involved in the work of the church, and what response do we get? Don't have time. No, by the time we work our 40-hour jobs, spend the time on the lake that we want to spend, and yeah, I'll go ahead and say it, spend the time on the tennis court that we want to spend, do everything that we want to do for ourselves, how much time do we have left for God? Just don't have time. How far removed are we in our own personal lives from the Israel described by Amos? Think about that.